Much has been said and is still being said about Michael the Brave, whose legend has grown over the centuries to a point where he cannot longer be completely separated from historical truth. That he was a brilliant general and a political genius is undeniable. His victories over the Turks echoed far and wide. King Henry IV of France wrote to his ambassador in Constantinople asking for information on the Wallachian, while his exploits became the basis of folk ballads across the Balkans among the Greeks, Bulgarians and Serbs. Yet, paradoxically, Michael was not well loved by the people of his own country. How could this be? Firstly, because military efforts severely worsened the condition of the peasants. Michael needed a powerful army, and by his time, the end of the 16th century, it was no longer possible to deploy peasant armies, not after cannons and firearms had appeared on the battlefield. You needed mercenaries, professional soldiers who knew how to handle firearms, a phenomenon that also occurred across Western Europe. Here is just one example. In 1525, Francis I of France fought Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, at the Battle of Pavia. Technically, the battle was a clash between Spain, which by that time possessed colonies in the Americas, its fleets of ships returned laden with gold and silver every year, and the Kingdom of France, the most populous and united country in Europe. Francis I, who was captured during the battle, fielded 2,500,000 men and faced a Spanish army of unequal size. But it is interesting to know who the actual combatants were. As it turns out, the French army consists of 5,000 French knights supported by 20,000 Swiss mercenaries, while on the other side 20,000 German mercenaries made up the bulk of a Spanish army, which included just 5,000 Spanish knights. In a way, one could say that the Battle of Pavia was a showdown of swords between German and Swiss soldiers of fortune. Michael the Brave waged wars using the boyars around him, their household troops, as well as some rozaici, which meant free peasants, but mostly with mercenaries, unfortunately, and they did not come cheap. We still have all the payrolls, so we know exactly how many Serbian, Albanian, Hungarian or Székelys mercenaries he used and who they were. As I have already mentioned, Michael was thought to be an illegitimate son of Patrascu the Good. Yet, interestingly enough, as several historians have recently proven, his mother, Theodora, was a Cantacuzinus, and as such, a descendant of one of the most illustrious Byzantine families which produced two emperors in the 14th century. Ruined after the fall of Constantinople, the Cantacuzines went into hiding for 2 or 3 generations and reappeared at the beginning of the 16th century in Constantinople. One member in particular stood out, the infamous Michael Cantacuzinus, the son of the Satan. Either way, recently discovered documents prove beyond a doubt that she was indeed a Cantacuzinus who had come to Wallachia as a wealthy merchant, that it was her family's money and influence with the Grand Vizier that secured Michael the Brave election as voivode. Coalition of Emperor Rudolf II. By the end of the 16th century, our voivodes were no longer elected by the boyars. The Ottoman Sultan could intervene if so he wished, which meant that Michael the Brave was originally his man and that of the Greeks in Constantinople, but Michael was an ambitious man and a great strategist, and almost immediately turned against his former protectors. Here I must again refer to the international context, a time of crisis in Constantinople with border wars in Asia and unpredictable successions to the throne. At the same time, in the Christian world, an emperor in Prague, which was the imperial seat at the time, who decided to take up arms against the Turks and was sending envoys to the Prince of Transylvania, yet another Báthory, Sigismund, and to the voivodes of Wallachia, Michael the Brave, and Moldavia, Aaron the Tyrant, trying to persuade them to join his coalition. Thus, Michael the Brave's incredible story begins at the time when the emperor was setting out on an anti-Ottoman crusade with support from the Pope. Therefore, the campaigns of Michael and his boyars were not just a reckless attempt to shed the Turkish yoke, which had become heavier and heavier. The empire of the Ottomans had reached its greatest territorial extent, and we now know it entered an era of economic decline. For example, inflation caused the Ottoman silver asper to lose its value or to become devalued in modern times. As a result of this, the Sultan demanded ever more in tribute from Wallachia in Moldavia. At first 10 times more, then 100 times more. The social impact was devastating. Peasants had to pay such high taxes that there was hardly anything left of the harvest for them to survive on. Extreme poverty led many free peasants, moshne and razești, to enter serfdom on a boyar's estate to avoid paying the harash and have someone to protect them. So the 16th century marks the beginning of a very painful historical phenomenon in our principalities, whereby more and more people of the free peasantry became serfs to the great nobility. In the meantime, the great boyars, who were responsible for collecting the tribute, grew poorer themselves and were eager to get rid of the Turks. Michael the Brave's wars cannot be separated from international context and the severe economical hardships of the time, to which liberation from Ottoman tyranny was the only alternative. But before he could fight the Turks, Michael had to accommodate the emperor and enter a treaty with the Prince of Transylvania. The Treaty of 1595 may seem humiliating to us today, in that the Prince of Transylvania, the megalomaniac Sigismund Báthory, a young nephew of King Stefan Báthory, who called himself Krai, or king, and had ambitions to reign over the three Romanian voivodeships, effectively became the suzerain of both Wallachia and Moldavia after the boyars signed in. Thus, one prince, Sigismund, came to rule in Transylvania and Moldavia and Wallachia. People then ask, how could it be that Michael's boyars had signed such a thing? It was treason. Either that or they did not know what they were signing. Not at all. They signed the treaty because it was in their interest to do so. The Wallachian delegation consisted of 12 great boyars, the metropolitan, and 2 bishops. The clergymen were interested in Sigismund extending their jurisdiction over the Orthodox in Transylvania, while the boyars used the treaty to request that their voivode could no longer put them to death without permission from the Prince of Transylvania, precisely what the Major Tere had requested back in 1247 before the dismounting, from the King of Hungary, that is, to be able to appeal to the royal court before his vassals, that sentences were carried out. The treaties also stipulated that executive powers, as they are called nowadays, would be shared between the voivode and the 12 ministers of the Sfat. Therefore, both the clergy and the boyars had clear vested interest in the treaty, and Michael the Brave had no choice but to accept it, because he needed financial and military support from Báthory. War broke out immediately after the treaty was signed, and the Turks crossed the Danube, led by the famous general Sinan Pasha. This was when the famous Battle of Cologăren took place on 23rd of August 1595, halfway between Giurgiu and Bucharest. The Romanians found themselves facing the enemy on their own. It was a victory, but like that of Rovine, it did not expel the enemy from the land. The Turkish army was not completely destroyed and did not retreat across the Danube, which forced Michael the Brave to retreat to the mountains and wait for Sigismund. Báthory arrived with the reinforcements, and their combined armies, almost equal in size, defeated the Turks 3 times and threw them across the Danube. Naturally, Sigismund took full credit for the victory in the west and returned to Transylvania not before accepting some changes to the treaty with Wallachia, which Michael had requested, such as relinquishing control of Wallachia's treasury. The following year, however, the Turks were on the offensive again, this time aiming at the central Hungary, where they defeated the imperial armies in the autumn of 1596, forcing the Austrians to temporarily sue for peace. Michael succeeded in doing the same and was again confirmed as voivode of Wallachia by the Sultan in exchange for paying the tribute. In the meantime, he also signed a new treaty directly with the emperor in 1598 without involving Sigismund Báthory. A fickle and power-hungry character, Sigismund had abdicated because of conflicts with the magnates of Transylvania. He was replaced by one of his cousins, Cardinal Andrew Báthory, who broke with Sigismund's policy and refused to ally himself with Rudolf, Wallachia and Moldavia. He was a friend with the Poles and they wanted peace with the Turks at the time so they could fight their wars elsewhere against the Germans or the Russians. Thus, the Poles made peace with the Turks, ousted Michael's ally Stefan VIII Răzvan, yet another bastard, the son of a gypsy man, who was probably responsible for introducing the Iranian name Răzvan, the equivalent of the Archangel Gabriel, to our country, and placed Jeremia Movila, a client of the Polish king, on the throne of Moldavia. For this reason, Michael crossed the mountains in October 1599 and defeated Prince Andrew Báthory at Celimbor, near Sibiu. It is interesting to know that it was Székelys mercenaries who captured and beheaded the cardinal. Here I will digress and emphasize that it's a mistake to look at the past from a modern perspective. If conflicts nowadays are largely ethnicity related, back in the 16th century they were more likely to have a social cause, serfs against nobles, etc., or religious one. As we have already seen, Reformation had effectively transformed the whole of Catholic Europe into a vast battleground between Catholics and Protestants. In our case, Székelys had almost entirely converted to Calvinism, whereas their new prince was a Catholic, and a high-ranking one at that, a cardinal. But above all, the foremost reason for their hatred towards Andrew Báthory was the fact that shortly after coming to the throne, he had reinstated some of the heavy taxes that his predecessor had waived. That is why Székely peasants sided with Michael against Báthory, whose slaying had not been ordered by the Wallachian voivode. According to a chronicle, as the triumph of Székelys were presenting Michael with Báthory's bloodied head, Michael was said to have exclaimed, "Poor priest."